All right, everybody. I guess I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I guess yeah, it looks like everyone got some people showing up. All right, so welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art. My name is Ollie Wagner. I'm the manager of studio programs. Before we get going, let me remind y'all that we are going to be recording this, and I will be sending a recording out to everyone probably mid next week. If you guys have any questions during the demo, you guys can feel free to just type them in the chat. Also, there's few enough people that I can just unmute you guys so you guys can just chime in whenever you'd like to if you want to. But we're going to do a brief Q&A session towards the end after the demo. So you can also save questions for that. Let me see what else. Real quick, I just want to plug next month's programs. Next month for our virtual demo, we have Raleigh artist Isabel Liu. And I'm going to put the link to that in the chat in a little bit. And we also have a drawing and meditation workshop in the museum park with Maureen O'Neill. She's over from Barton College in Wilson. All right. So after all that, so today's artist is Janine Biunno. Me and Janine go way back. She's a Brooklyn artist, and she's also archivist for the Noguchi Museum. And she's going to be here today to talk about her artwork and demonstrate a little bit of it. And yeah, I've been looking forward to this. Are you ready to go, Janine?
I am ready. Thank you
All
so
right.
much for inviting me to do this. I
Yeah.
have like a little slide presentation, so I'll show you guys
Okay.
a little bit about my work just to kind of get a bit of a conceptual background, and then I'll get into um the demo. So hi everyone. Thanks for joining. As Ollie said, an artist and archivist based in Brooklyn, New York. I work at the Noguchi Museum, where I'm the head of archives there, and I've been working there since 2015. So a lot of my work sort of balances sort of the art and archivist side of my life, which is why it's pertinent. I'm
Hey,
also
Janine, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring your phone. It's just showing a blank screen for you.
oh really? Okay, hold on.
Yeah. Yeah, you're good.
Okay. All right, we're back in business. Uh anyway, yeah, so I work in the Noguchi Museum. I also teach an archives course at the Pratt Institute. And I'm also a practicing artist when time allows. I work mostly in printmaking and drawing. I make a lot of zines, and I also work in watercolor, which is what I'll talk about in the demo today. Um, my interest in and education in art is really what led me into the archives profession. So that's sort of where the connection is there. I am trying to, does the next slide advance? It like
Yeah,
froze on
yeah,
my
it's
end.
moving through.
Okay, sorry, it froze on my end. We're all complicated here. Okay. Anyway, I make work that mostly references architecture, infrastructure, and the built environment, and the link between structure and perceived meaning in reference to like our own subjective experience in cities. In other words, I think a lot about our own personal way of seeing space. And I also tap a lot into how digital experience has mitigated our understanding of space. So especially like well-known iconic spaces, as we're now able to kind of experience the world at our fingertips through our computers and have been for many years. So my interest in cities and buildings led me to initially find work in the architectural field after completing my MFA in 2008. And I spent just over 7 years working for architect Stephen Hall as the director of publications, exhibitions, and archives there. It was a pretty diverse job, but my main responsibility there was to research and development, to do research and development for the publications and exhibitions that the office produced. But one of the best parts of that job was that often my research for work did double duty, as it was really relevant to my artwork at the same time. So there was like a real benefit in there. And it led me to also exploring a lot of remnant materials left behind from the architectural design process. And even more generally, it sort of changed the way I looked at space. So this slide shows two pieces that sort of exemplify that experience. On the left is a cutout of shapes of a variety of drop shadows that I encountered in my daily commuting. I regularly and still do take like a ton of photos of things that interest me, in particular, sort of the phenomena of light and space, sort of found geometry, or like geometric compositions within like kind of structures that you encounter. And the images on the right are from a zine that was made by photocopying scraps of boards and wood that were left behind from the laser cutter from the creation of architectural models. So I've always had a desire to sort of distill visual information down to its simplest form, almost into a pictograph language, like what you would see on signs to use to designate utility, to convey it to the widest audience possible. So as an artist, I'm primarily interested in the often overlooked in-between spaces and physical boundaries of all the different structures that comprise cities, and not just like formal structures like buildings, but also just broken down things, piles of things, stuff that you just encounter just from like, you know, the detritus of human life, not just like a skyscraper. This idea was sort of largely informed by Kevin Lynch's The Image of the City, wherein he classified the contents of the city images into 5 types of elements. Those elements are paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. And those 5 elements are what we apply in the practice of psychogeography, which is the study of the influence of the geographical environment on the mind or on behavior. Or more simply, it's just like mental map making, how you designate space, how you remember space, not just street signs, but like your own personal landmarks. So with this in mind, this image here shows the first big project that started this body of work. This is 2012. And I've been sort of evolving this body of work over the last decade or so. This is an installation of cutout sheets of paper. The cutouts are all derived from the continual gathering of images, both via photographing my daily commute across New York City, and also by simultaneously searching the internet for existing imagery of the same locations, sort of viewed through someone else's lens. These reference images, equal parts original and digitally sourced, are used to investigate the relationship between both representation and interpretation in the built environment, and sort of exemplify those 5 elements in my own mental map making process. And this exhibition was titled How Things Stand, and it included 30 kind of constructivist inspired cutouts and an accompanying takeaway zine of a selection of the reference materials, which was intended to provide context to the minimalist works, which is kind of a tool I utilize a lot in my practice. I'll get into a little bit more. At the same time, I was also interested in exploring different materials and seeing how I could transform them. Both these pieces were derived from laser cutter scraps from the model making shop at the architectural office where I was working. To me, with these leftover materials, I saw really beautiful shapes and compositions that reflected the urban fabric they were intended to simulate. Though I was also fascinated with taking shapes in a 2-dimensional form that were used to create a 3-dimensional object. This is also another recurring theme in my work. Well, actually, I'll get into it in another slide. So this is an example of a large scale work, which was hand cut. The shapes are all varying views of the central void in Rem Koolhaas's famous CCTV building in Beijing, as experienced through Google image search. I have not been to Beijing. This is 40 inches by 26 inches. This is what the Google image search looks like. So the shape I'm talking about is that sort of center void. So if you look at this sort of individual shape in the middle of the building, that's what all these shapes are. It's just sort of a series of them all gridded out. Another recurring theme or format rather in my work is to create an accompanying zine, which gives some context to the minimalist artworks. I do this to shift the experience of the viewer a bit. At first encounter, my work feels purely abstract, likely rooted in architecture. Like I feel like it has, you know, a sort of structural feeling to it. But I like providing viewers with this additional moment of realization that might change how they see things themselves. I don't always make a zine to accompany my artwork, but it's become a bit of a pattern with these cutouts specifically. I And so I also make zines independently as like it's standalone pieces, not as a companion piece. It's just something I've done since I was really like a teenager going to punk shows. That's where the whole the whole zine thing came from. And it's something I never let go of. Both as a printmaker, which is really what I did in grad school, and with zines, I was always interested in sort of the like most egalitarian dissemination of information possible. And that to me was sort of the root of creating prints and creating things like zines, which are meant to be sort of ephemeral and given away. This is another example from that series, based on the many iconic and lesser known views of the Giza pyramids in Egypt, which is obviously one of the most widely known physical structures in the world. This is a triptych. The center piece is 40 by 26, and then the side pieces are about, I think, 19 by 26. And then this is also, it's black paper that has black screen printing on it. So the sort of darker triangles, and then it's hand cut. The white is all hand cut paper. Another recurring theme, which I mentioned before, is the two-dimensional depiction of three-dimensional space. This interest stemmed out of working in architecture. A big part of my job was to visually explain three-dimensional space on the two-dimensional page of a book. Creating books on the many projects that the office built. So I had to sort of organize the information, the drawings and such, to sort of give viewers, not just through photographs, but through a few other tools, the idea of what the space was like without physically inhabiting it. There are a lot of tools in architecture to explain space, like exploded axonometrics and unfolded drawings, which are tools that show the space sort of opened up, and it creates really unusual shapes that really don't reflect reality at all, but it's something that in architectural training you learn to understand how to describe space. These drawing types really created unique shapes sort of onto the shapes unto themselves and look nothing like the building at all that it was created to explain. There are a lot of idiosyncratic moments like this in the architectural process where the tools for depiction look nothing like the thing itself. So with that in mind, this piece is made from panels of wood that were left over from the laser cutter, again, from model making. And the notched square shaped holes, like the big central void, is where the flat pieces were removed for the building of a 3D model. And I thought the remnant panels are really interesting with their missing pieces. And then I laser etched a pattern onto them. So I used the laser cutter tool again, but not to cut through it, just to etch it. And the pattern on them is a combination of the 11 possible ways that you can unfold a cube. I put some of the examples below on the slide, these like black shapes at the bottom. You can only unfold a cube in 11 possible variations. And then it also has a selection of shapes from Solowit's variations of incomplete open cubes, another artwork that addressed a similar concept. And this is sort of a close-up of what the etching looked like on the panels. So this leads me to the next body of work. I mentioned how I've always had an ongoing fascination with how we comprehend the built environment. Within that framework, I focus both on the iconographic as well as the ubiquitous nature of the structures we collectively identify as cities. There are certain things we take for granted or come to expect. Construction sites, for example, have become just as much a part of the city as like a landmark structure. I've also had a continual interest in searching for found geometry or geometric compositions within the built environment. My eye is sort of always seeking out shapes that can translate into my work. Part of my practice is just exploring urban space and documenting what I find as I go and creating my own mental maps, which is that sort of psychogeographic practice that I talked about earlier. And then these findings are regularly translated into sort of abstract compositions. So in New York City, the landscape's constantly shifting. It's constantly there's constant construction, constant building, and around every single new construction site in the city are these forest green construction fences. They're just made from 8x4 panels of plywood. And on these construction fences, by law, there has to be a 12-inch by 12-inch panel cut out every 25 feet. How each construction team chooses to acknowledge and apply this law to their own site varies greatly. Some are really carefully, like precisely, perfectly cut out. Others are completely haphazard, as you can kind of see. This is sort of a combination. The one on the left isn't that neat either. Actually, they're both a little haphazard. They're supposed to have a plexiglass window inserted, again, handled sort of subjectively, if at all. I started to really notice the variety between these shapes and their handling, and came to enjoy the way these windows would frame the landscape. So I started to create these studies using the shapes created by these construction windows. These are block prints that I made with sort of hand cut foam shapes that I printed. And then I started to explore the potential of the shapes in conversation with each other, kind of considering them each as three-dimensional objects. And this is the same block print process, but I also use this orange India ink to kind of draw them out. And then I also made this cutout and screen print diptych using those clusters of shapes. I don't even know how many hundreds of photos I have of these construction walls on my phone, but they're all sort of pulled from that. I first screen printed black shapes on the black paper and then cut out the compositions on top of them. So I also made this accompanying zine called Post No Bills, which is based off of the text stencil you can see on the left. You see all over the city on these walls. Each zine came wrapped in a band of black paper with a little cutout in it of the three shapes. It's always a triangle, a diamond, or a square. It's supposed to be a square, but it's obviously there's some variety. And on the right is a version of the zine I made. The far right is the version I made that was like a single folded sheet format, which is another way you can create a zine. And these are a few of my favorite spreads from the zine. And it was sort of a combination. It was both about the geometry of these windows, but also their function as a portal kind of within the built environment to like frame space. So that's what this is. And then lastly, I want to talk to you about my watercolors, because that's what we're going to do the demo on. This is my most recent active body of work, and where much of my focus has been over the last 5 years or so, and what we'll play around with in the demo. Going back to some of the earlier concepts, I've been addressing my work for a long time, is the notion of a boundary. I mentioned before this person, Kevin Lynch, who wrote this book on psychogeography called The Image of the City, and sort of these classifications of like how you define space. So these watercolors address some personal landmarks, and these are just mansard roofs that I would see near my job in Queens. I don't know if any of you have spent time in Queens, but it's a lot of row houses, and people sort of adorn these very rectangular buildings with a lot of additional architectural flair, let's call it. So there's a few buildings that had just like these almost adhered roofs that sort of slope down, and that's what these shapes are, almost like porticos. So they also, for me, was in terms of the boundary concept, I wanted to create this invisible boundary of water on paper. When we get into the technique used here, it's a wet on wet process. And the first step is filling the area you want to add color to with water while keeping the rest of the page dry. And with this process, you can manage to keep a really hard line between the fluidity of the pigment and the white of the paper. And I really wanted to have this sort of dichotomy between like stark hard edge and then this like very fluid, almost like tie-dye effect. So these are two other examples of this watercolor process, and more akin to what I think we'll go over more so in the demo. But these paintings use painter's tape, which is another method, and I'll get into sort of both ways you can do this to maintain the boundary. These particular watercolors were about nodes, which is a term used to describe a junction or an intersection or convergence of paths. In this case, both of these shapes were derived from ground up views of space between the buildings at busy intersections. So if you imagine like laying on your back and looking up and in like a tight intersection where you could actually still see the edges of the buildings that surround you. That's sort of like what the convergence of the edge of those shapes are. These are part of my planar study series, which are just experiments that utilize the same technique of wet on wet washes while maintaining a hard edge. I'm really interested in ways that I can add depth to the page while still maintaining a really simple process. And also, again, sort of that conversation about two-dimensional versus three-dimensional, or two-dimensional planes with three-dimensional depictions of space. And lastly are these two. These are part of the same planar studies series, but I should have just called them fake architecture. I'm always looking again for ways to add the depth to the page. So in this case, I wanted to build up actual structures and also look at how light and shadow would interact with these imagined shapes. Okay, so that's all for my kind of pre-demo talk, and I have my contact information here if anyone want to reach out or has any questions after the talk or wants to see more work on my website. And also, actually, this background image is another print I made that are shapes pulled from the sort of aforementioned unfolded drawings, which is a way, again, one of those tools used in describing architectural space. Okay, so I will stop my screen share. And we can talk a little bit about the demo. So Ollie, can you, is it pinned? Can we pin the
Yeah, I can. Where's your other camera? Oh, right here.
Yeah. I apologize that the orientation of the camera is vertical. We got it horizontal at one point and it went back, but it's a small piece of paper, so I feel like it should work. There are a few steps. I'll talk a little bit about materials first, and then about how to sort of build out your shape, and then we'll get into painting it. So I like to work with cold press paper. I like that it has a little bit of a texture to it, which you can kind of see, like a little bit of teeth to it. It's not too rough, but I think that it holds and absorbs liquid really well, especially because this is a very wet process. I like to use, this is Arches Aquarelle cold press, 140 pound. And for the sake of this demo, I'm working pretty small. This is just 8x8 sheets here. Oh yeah, so and then this was the other brand I was talking about, which is a fluid. This is just a really affordable one, but I still think it's a great paper. I think it's a slightly the same weight. Yeah, same weight, 140 pound. Okay, so I already have on this one drawn out just in very light pencil a shape that we'll work with. And then on this one, we can do it with the tape. But I also in advance, I have a little palette. You want to choose one or two colors, and you want to mix, and I'll do this in a second, but you want to mix sort of two densities of it. And I have, show you, I work a lot of times with India inks, but I also work with palette. So this is the watercolors that I like to use. They are the Japanese brand Kuretake. Let's see, it's backwards, but that's it. They're really, really lovely. And I'm gonna choose two colors to work with today. And do this sort of red color and something that will complement that if you mix it, it's not going to turn like muddy and brown, is a good way to go. So I might go with just like a red and an orange together, something close adjacent. Okay, I also have 3 containers of water. You can get away with 2. I'll do 3 oftentimes if the 2 colors I'm working with are pretty far away in value. So I'll have 1 container each like this for rinsing out 1 color's brushes and 1 for the other. And then I have a separate container for just cleaning brushes overall. So this water will probably get pretty muddy, and the other one I try to keep pretty clean as like a wash that I can use to sort of add to the paper actually. So then in terms of brushes, I like really soft brushes for this process. Shapes are up to you in terms of preference. I always like an angled brush, a flat. I also really enjoy a filbert and a round. Honestly, anything that you're comfortable with, as long as it's soft, is going to work well here. These are all medium to large because this is a shape that doesn't have too much detail, but for some of my more precise ones, I'll go with something a lot smaller, so I can get into the edges. But I feel pretty confident that I can do sort of a medium. Maybe I'll go with, I'm gonna choose 1 for each color right now. And okay. All right, I'm gonna go with these 2, 1 for each color. And then before I start making my washes, I'm gonna also tape out very quickly a simple shape, and I'll show you my favorite tape, which I think is the best one to use, in that it comes up really clean. The key though is with tape, on any painting surface, patience, it has to dry. Okay, so my favorite tape is frog tape, and this yellow one is the super delicate surface, which I think is a really kind of amazing product. So what I'm gonna do is just, you can tear it. I like to use scissors just to get a clean edge. Sometimes I'll cut a bigger piece and just trim down. So we can build out any shape. If you want to do something that's more literal, you can take the time to build that out too, but for the sake of this demo, and also because in a lot of my pieces, I like to kind of layer shapes. So sometimes going with a more simple shape is really beneficial, and that I can keep layering more stuff on it. Anyway, this is not anything specific. It is not referencing any specific shape, even though I just went in depth on how everything is about something. This is just for getting something onto the paper. And you can definitely get pretty ornate with this too, as you saw in some of my examples. They vary quite a bit. And you can, as long as you keep the page wet, you can keep working on it for a while. So it's not too, you're not too limited. Okay, trim off the piece. Okay, that is my basic shape I'm doing. And again, as I mentioned, if you're doing the tape method, you really have to let it 100% dry, or you can use a hair dryer, but you want the paper bone dry before you start peeling up. Otherwise, you're going to ruin your paper, and it'll all be a waste. So, okay. So again, tape brand. Okay. So if I'll start with the one on without the tape first, and then I'll do the one with the tape. It's the same principle. It's very straightforward. Okay, so I have my palette. I'm going to just move this temporarily so I can mix my colors while it's visible. Okay, so water. So I'm gonna load the brush pretty heavily with pigment. And then with the water that I kind of designated for each color, make a bit of a wash. You want to make a pretty substantial amount depending on how big your shape is, but you don't want to run out and then have to try to make more and risk your page drying. Oh, the other thing that you should have is paper towels, which are just out of frame, but for anyone familiar with the watercolor process, having paper towels nearby is always helpful to dry off your brushes in between and sometimes quickly soak up mistakes. Okay, so that's pretty good. And then using the water, I'm going to make sort of a lighter wash next to it. And I might add a little bit of pigment, but it's not nearly going to be as dense as the one to the side. And also the water itself now is my third level of density. It's like a very light wash of the same color. Okay. That's that one. And then I'll do the lighter orange, or maybe I'll do like a yellow instead, something a little bit more different. Okay, I'm switching a little bit, something a little bit different. Anyway, same process. Smaller brush, so it's taking slightly longer. All right, and then a more washy one here. Okay. That's good enough for the purposes of setting this up. Okay, and then I still, again, have right off camera, I have and I'm also going to keep my two little color blocks nearby in the case that I do have to quickly mix up some more. Move the palette off. And then, all right, back here. Okay, so now at this point, I'm going to go to the clean water, which was my third container of water. And I'm gonna have to rinse out this brush pretty good. Now you could use your sort of lightly tinted water if you wanted to here, but if you want to maintain any white in the shape that you're trying to fill, going with the clean water is the way to go. Okay, so the first thing you do is, again, get your paper towels handy in case you have to clean up quickly. That's just right next to it. And you want to, with as much precision as possible, fill your shape. And the key here is to not drip or move outside the shape, because as long as you keep the part that you want to fill with pigment wet and the rest of the page dry, and it's pretty wet. It's hard to see, I think, in the camera right now, but you don't want it so it's dripping off the page. But my brush is pretty loaded. And then once you have it filled, kind of look at it from the side. And you can see if it's still wet, and you can add more water after you fill it. So I'm trying to, my water is like ever so slightly tinted, which is actually helpful to see. The whole area is wet, and then I'm going to just lift it up, look at it from an angle, make sure nothing's dripping out, but that the whole area, that you don't see anything that's starting to dry. This edge a little bit better. And I'm moving pretty fast, but it's okay to sort of take your time and be extra precise with laying down this first wash to be sure that it's going to work. Okay, so now that it's filled, I'm going to actually start adding even more water to really dampen the page. And I'm using a watercolor block because I want the page to stay tight. But if you are familiar with watercolor and you know how to stretch a piece of paper, that is another way you can do this. Anyway, so adding lots of water, really getting it wet. Okay, then we can start going in with our colors. So if I load my brush with one of the deeper pigments, I need to start dropping color in. And you can tilt your page a little bit if you start seeing it moving a little bit too much towards the edge. It should maintain that boundary. And you can kind of go in a little bit closely. This is why I like the angle brushes too, because you can get that sort of fine tip. And it just starts to fill, and just sort of let it bleed. It's a pretty organic process. I find that a lot of the shapes that come out of just dropping the ink in or the watercolor pigment in is like the happy accident of it all. Let it do its thing. If you try to force it too much, that's when I feel like it starts to get muddy and a bit sloppy. All right, so I'm gonna put brush, I'm gonna add a little bit of the yellow. And my page is pretty wet, so this is pretty washy. You can start waiting for it to dry a little bit too if you want to have a harder boundary in it. Sometimes I'll even go in last with like black, like in those sort of watercolory ones of the mansard roofs. I try to not let brush strokes show too much in the process. So I'm just trying to move it, let it move around. If you see your water starting to pool, you can kind of pull it out a little. Tilt your page, let it move a little. That's sort of the lighter wash. And you can be patient here and just sort of wait it out and see where it goes. Or if you feel like, there's a little bit more water here than I want, I am noticing one part of mine. This is where paper towel comes in handy. You can just sort of sop it up a little bit and just like tap a corner and it just soaks it up. Anyway, anyone who's familiar with watercolor, this is a pretty basic wet on wet technique, but for people that aren't, it is a little bit magical. Kind of letting the paint sort of move around. Even add in a darker, maybe I'll add in a darker color just because why not? I'm gonna go like super primary, I guess. I'm going with a blue now. So I now have a blue. I don't know why I'm going so primary today, but nonetheless, if I want to add more water at this point, I would take a totally clean brush, and kind of wet areas, different areas again. I know I just soaked up a bunch of water, but it wasn't where I wanted it. So now I'm going to move more water where I want it. Try not to disturb the other colors. Cool. Drip in. Okay. Now I'm gonna add red over here. I'll wet that area. And you can lift up color a bit too if you use another wet brush into an area that already has pigment on it. Anyway, that's getting a little muddy, but nonetheless, same principle. And then if you don't really like the way it showed worked out, the paper towel friend again. Up some of it. Okay. Anyway, that's more or less the idea if you're doing with the edge of using the wet on wet to sort of mark the edge. And I'll show you with the tape. You can be a little bit looser with it because you have sort of the safety of the tape to protect it. So on this one, I'm going to use a green. And I'm going to use a bigger brush And that's the color. Okay, so same thing, you're going to fully wet the area. And this one, I'm going to do sort of more of that stripy look that was in the sort of red and blue works that I showed. So it feels pretty wet. Moisture also with this tape kind of creates a seal. So this is actually helping sort of ensure that there isn't really any seepage underneath the tape. Same thing, make it probably more wet than you think is necessary. And then since I'm just going to do a single color, I can go straight from this. And if you just drag it down. And if I'm doing a single color wash like this, I might let it dry a bit and then add more density between. So it looks messy, but when it dries and the edge comes up, it's very clean, which is nice. Okay. So I know that doesn't look like much of anything yet. But I guess maybe by the time we're done with everything, I'll be able to lift off the tape. Might be a little bit too fast, but I'll clean up a little of this edge. Sometimes where the tape overlaps, I've had pigment kind of seep in. So it doesn't hurt to kind of clean it up a little bit while you wait for it to dry. So you don't have any, additional possibility of sort of ruining the clean edge. Okay. So that can just sort of chill for a bit. And for those of you with a hair dryer on hand or in your studio, that is a perfect opportunity to use that. But I'll leave that here for now. Okay. Anyway, that's more or less it for the demonstration of the technique. I don't know if anyone has any questions about it. I'm happy to answer. But yeah, pretty straightforward method.
All right, does anyone have any questions? I've got some questions for you.
Okay.
Let's see. So, I guess in your artwork, you tend to draw a lot of inspiration from like nature, the environment around you. So specifically, what specifically inspires you, and how do you translate that into your creative process? Other than I guess elaborate a little bit on the architecture aspects.
Oh yeah. I guess I've always sort of been inspired by my surroundings. I've always worked, even when I was in grad school, and I had to sort of figure out ways to integrate the things I was encountering and sort of like my normal daily life to sort of feed into my creative process. And I know that sounds really pragmatic, but as someone that sort of always appreciated, geometry in terms of like how it relates to artistic abstraction, and especially that I've lived in cities for the last 24 years or so, that I've kind of been surrounded by sort of the density of your sort of average American city, and that I started to find a lot of beauty and sort of hidden compositions within it. So For me, it just started collecting. And I know that this is like something we all do, but especially in like the smartphone era, like we all have a really good digital camera in our pockets. And it's funny because this body of work stemmed out of, I guess, when it started when I was in grad school and I was just using a regular digital camera, but I used to carry it around everywhere. Um, and it grew from that, just like a constant documentation. And, in this sort of smartphone era, in particular, there's been like a major uptick for me in how much I accumulate images. I used to spend more time, I would say, combing the internet. That was the other thing. I was behind a computer a lot at work. And in my downtime, and also, as I mentioned, the architecture job, when I was doing a lot of research, I was sort of collecting all these images as I would go. So I was kind of creating this little inventory of things that sort of visually inspired me for a long time also. And this is going to like date me a tiny bit, but like many, many years ago, I used to keep a Tumblr where I just would put all those images. So I had like a place to store them. Thousands of images. I think it still is up there somewhere, but I haven't updated it in a really long time. So for me, it's always been about this kind of like constant indexing. And that is what connects it a lot to my role as an archivist. Creating information systems is what I do for a job, making information accessible, and also understanding, the information that we receive. Like information literacy, I think, is like one of the biggest challenges of society today, because we all, I guess we can unpin my,
Oh,
we can
right.
unpin my paper. Thanks, Anne. We receive so much information, we have a hard time sort of determining, it can be hard to determine what is real, who produced it, where it came from. And that's a lot also what I sort of encounter. That's what information school is about. So that's in terms of like the digital side of it. And also the creation of a glossary or an index of shapes and spaces. That is where it kind of connects into what I do in my like day-to-day work. But I guess the short answer to that is just it's always kind of connected to working and commuting and all these sort of like mundane things that have become a part of my life, and trying to source inspiration from somewhere. And for me, I've always found cities to be really beautiful and interesting. And that became like sort of an easy connection to me.
And you've been at the Noguchi Museum now for what, 7, 8 years?
Almost, yeah, 7.5 years now. And it's a bit of a haul. It's in, I mean, Queens and Brooklyn unto themselves are massive cities. So I'm really traversing a lot of area to get from point A to point B. I get to work from home I do like a hybrid schedule since I guess the primary part of the pandemic, we were all working from home. But now it's more or less a hybrid schedule.
And how have you? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, with that, I feel like I've noticed
Yeah.
my commute more than ever before. Like for so long, it just was the thing you did. Everybody commuted in New York, and average commute is like 30 minutes to an hour, like walking, subway, etc. And that was just built into your day. And now that almost feels intolerable. Like it's so much of your day. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about balancing working as a professional museum worker and as an artist.
It's anyone with a full-time job or family can definitely attest to the challenges of trying to do everything. I had a son like right as the pandemic started too, so that I feel like threw me off the most, because up until that point I kind of figured out a balance between my life as an artist and my life as someone that has always had to work full-time. And that space got sucked up very quickly by having to care for someone else. And now that he's about 3, or he's just turned 3, I feel like I'm starting to kind of balance all 3 together now. But I think that's a really continual challenge. I think for anyone, no matter what your life is, there's always this kind of juggling act of responsibilities. So I think for me, like going back to your earlier question, that was a big reason why I was sourcing material from things like my commute or from work. And it, the choice to work in an architecture office after grad school was a very conscious choice. I was already making work about the built environment, so I thought it would be really interesting and beneficial to work in that environment, and it really did pay off. It was a crazy place to work. I think anyone, I don't know if anyone here has worked in architecture, but it's borderline masochistic. I had to work very intensely, but I did get a lot of information. Anne, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Really interesting, Janine. I haven't lived up north for many, many years, so you talk so fast.
Oh.
And I know we used to talk fast like that, but I don't do it anymore because I live in the South now.
I understand.
So you were talking about, thank God you went back to it, psychogeographic.
Yes.
And Kevin Lynch wrote a book. Do we have a title for that book?
It's called The Image of the City.
Okay, I got that written down. Somehow I got that written down, but I lost the connection.
Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds great.
Yes.
And
he wrote this book, I think it was the 70s or 80s, I can't remember exactly. And he had sort of 4 case studies for cities in it. The reason I found it is because I was working on my MFA in Boston at the time, and Boston was one of his case study cities. And my thesis was about the sort of map making, like understanding how to navigate Boston. I never felt comfortable there. It wasn't a place that I truly enjoyed living. So I was always trying to kind of find my way around. And I found this book through a lot of other books, research, and I never found a piece of writing that spoke more specifically to what I was trying to articulate visually. So it's something that I don't, read it constantly, but it's something that's always in the back of my mind in terms of what I'm trying to define. The content has changed in terms of what I'm creating, but that basic theory of how you break down the mental map making process and like what you use to define space is something that has stuck with me since 2007, probably. Yeah.
wow, that's great. I also I've been doing a lot with urban construction. So I'm inviting you and your family to come down and just wander around because Raleigh is just blossoming. There's construction everywhere. I'm trying to find the beauty in it. We don't have wood around our construction sites. We just have a little tiny fence kind of thing that you can see through. So come on down.
More than New York does. I've been to Raleigh, but it's been a long time.
You should come back. Your 3-year-old will love it. It's great.
I will come visit. Thank you.
Okay, and one more question. I'm sorry to take everybody's time here.
No, it's all good.
How things stand, right? That's what you were talking about. One of your
that was an installation.
Sort of. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you were talking really fast, and you said representation and I couldn't get the second word.
So
what do you talk about when you talk about how things stand?
Let's see. I'm trying to remember. There's a long time ago. What did I say?
It might not be that important.
No, it was
to miss things.
Oh, representation and interpretation.
Interpretation. Okay.
Yeah, and how things stand was I'm trying to remember. It was from like Wittgenstein. It was like he has like this list of theories, and I forget which one it is, but that was where it's like theories for structures or something. It was a long time ago, but that's where it came from because it was so much of it was about sort of dissecting structure. So it was both about how things are represented to us, but then again how you interpret the shapes. And since I made it like a very minimal cutout, it was just black paper hand cut against a white wall. It left a lot up to the imagination to sort of interpret what it was. And I felt like it visually, it nodded to architecture. Like you can see the architecture in it, but you couldn't specifically tell what anything was.
Great, thank you.
You're very welcome.
So this is a question I had for you. This is something that's like fanzines. I think me and you have kind of similar like youth background. So fanzines are like an idea that is like that's in my mind something that's pretty self-explanatory, but I wonder if you could expand on that just a little bit, because I think that's a really interesting part of your work.
Yeah.
It really resonates with me, and I really like kind of the stuff you've been doing in the past couple of years with that.
Thank you so
Especially
much.
especially how it kind of incorporates like a little bit of the like almost graphic design of like kind of the 70s like minimalist kind of graphic design too.
Definitely.
I love it.
I've always had a love of graphic design, and there was a point when I was deciding what to go to college for. When I went to Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, and they have a separate school for art and a separate school for design. So
Mhm.
you can't just be like a graphic design major in art school. So I really had to choose which way I wanted to go. And it was really tough because I have always had, and this I think goes back to what I was saying about like composition. Um, I have always had an eye for composition, how to like lay out a page. So I was naturally drawn to graphic design. And as a teenager, I guess I started maybe, I went to shows since I was probably in around like eighth grade probably, but I didn't start making a zine until maybe it was like junior year of high school. But I used to collect them. So it's like a normal thing when you go to these sort of like, punk rock and hardcore like indie shows, that people were making these little booklets, and I was so fascinated by the sort of I don't know, the ingenuity of it, the fact that it was just like the whole DIY culture, like just making your own and photocopying them, and people were, you know, putting poetry in them, interviews, photography, just like whatever you wanted it to be. And one of my best friends from growing up, who I'm still really close with now, my friend Cindy, she's also, had the same inclination. So we eventually were like, let's do it. Like, let's just make our own. And we made a couple issues of this thing called Scot Free Fanzine, and
Nice.
and it was full of everything. We had, record reviews, interviews. We're from Jersey, so I grew up in Jersey, so there's diner reviews, which is like an important part of Jersey culture. And I loved that process.
Yeah.
And it was maybe by my junior year in college, I started realizing that I could kind of integrate it into my art practice again. Like I maybe just didn't think of it as art in the same way.
Yeah.
I had a review, like end of year review my sophomore year, and I had mentioned that I was like kind of actively making this zine, and a couple of the professors on the review, who were like kind of old, punks at
Yeah.
art, were like, well, show it to us. I like ran up to my studio and got a copy of it, and they were like, they kind of said what I needed to hear to sort of legitimize it for me, because I was also so caught up in, don't get me wrong, I loved my undergrad experience, but it was also like very formal art school, very conceptual, and I was very caught up in like everything has to mean something, and I had these like, again, these separate channels, and that was where they kind of merged again. And I was like, oh, I can sort of make all these things fit, and I can sort of play around with graphic design and do all these things on my own. So but yeah, DIY culture for the win.
Yeah.
And I liked handing stuff out. I know, I remember like you did a lot of stickers and stuff like that. I liked that.
Yeah.
Out in the world.
Yeah, I think it was a long time before I realized that maybe sometimes that like fanzines are maybe some of the most interesting things I've ever done.
Yeah.
So here's another question. So what kind of advice would you give to people just starting out in the art world, or trying to maybe embark on like a art career, or not even art career, but even like any kind of like just make more art in their lives, or
I guess kind of what I said before about just like look around you. Don't discredit something just because it's sort of quotidian or something that you see every day. Just because you see it every day doesn't mean that everyone else sees it every day. And if people do see it every day, you're still seeing it differently than someone else. Like you're never going to look at something the same way as the person next to you. So don't discount looking at the inside of your house, your pets, your street, whatever. So whatever your surroundings are, and try to find inspiration in what's around you. And if you're not feeling particularly inspired by it, like do studies, just sort of make little things and sort of see where it leads you. I would say also, and I could use some of this advice myself, but like don't put too much pressure on yourself.
Mhm.
I think because I was graduating with student loan debt, I knew I always had to work. And in
Uh-huh.
some ways, I knew that I was not going to be making a living as an artist. And that took a lot of pressure off, actually, because it meant that I
Mhm.
could sort of make the work I wanted to make without feeling like I had to sell it or that it had to be exhibited. And don't get me wrong, it's great when you sell something and it's great when
Mhm.
someone wants to put your work up on a wall in a gallery. And I love when that happens. But it did sort of remove um that sort of pressure to make something that people will like, and instead just allowed me to make the things that I like and hope that people like it too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so like, is that also kind of how you, I guess, what like navigate sort of the fine line between marketability and artistic integrity?
Yeah. Again, like I wouldn't call it a luxury because working full time is exhausting.
Uh-huh.
But I do have this sort of luxury of not having to care
Uh-huh.
what the art market is right now. And like I said, it's awesome when someone buys something.
Yeah.
I participate in a lot of like flat files and that sort of thing, and I've had a decent amount of success selling small works. A lot of the water people like these watercolors. But in that way it does, yeah, it just sort of has allowed me to kind of remove myself from that conversation. It would be amazing if I could like, sell a painting for $20,000, but maybe not this year.
Um, and how, so, and so what kind of like strategies are you, or like, what is your approach, if at all, like to kind of marketing yourself as an artist? Like, how are you getting kind of out there and getting shows?
I do well, two things. One is New York, if anything, has the most incredible art scene. There's so many art scenes. It's not like a one-stop shop.
Mhm.
There's different art districts all over the city if you want to refer to them that way. There's just so many different places to go. So by working in the arts, by working in an art museum, most of the people I work with are artists. A lot of my friends from both undergrad and grad school, you
Mhm.
kind of connect with the people in the city that from different walks of life. You got to show up. I will say, like, the most success I've had in getting shows and getting my work out there happened when I was actively going to gallery openings, seeing people, getting to know people, asking for studio visits. And I'm not saying just with gallerists, but with other
Mhm.
artists. One, because it gives you really good feedback on your work, it'll only make your art better. And two, the more artists that you know, the greater, and I hate saying the word networking, but it's real. Like the more artists that you know, the more of a
Mhm.
sense of community that you feel.
Mhm.
You never know how that pays off. I've had some really amazing things happen just because of someone I knew from grad school and their friend worked at this gallery and they saw my work
Mhm.
or like I met this person over dinner and then like you end up with a studio visit. Next thing you know, you're in like a two-person show. Like that has happened.
Uh-huh.
Um, Obviously it has to be the right connecting of dots, but sometimes it is just like this very fortuitous stars
Yeah.
aligned thing. So being physically present is one. And the other one I'd say is social media goes a pretty long way.
Mhm.
I don't oversaturate. I will say I get a little bit
Mhm.
exhausted. I do know people that just like are hammering hammering
Mhm.
with information about, X, Y, and Z that they're doing. I love seeing what people are making. So I love when people post new art that they make. So I would say in terms
Mhm.
of a social media strategy that it's really awesome to see works in progress, finished works, and then work that you go see out in the world that you really like. Um, you see a painter or painting that you like, post a photo of it, tag the person, you know what I mean? Like just that kind of
Mhm.
stuff does pay off. I feel like sometimes if it's really oversaturated or, it's a super popular artist, like it's not necessarily the same thing. But if
Mhm.
you're going to a more local opening, I've definitely connected with people over social media because I saw an artist, a sculpture that I liked and tagged the person and then
Uh-huh.
ended up having like a quick chat with, in like the DMs with them, just
Yeah.
being like, I
Yeah.
really like your work.
Yeah.
That stuff goes away and like being genuine about it. That goes without saying.
people are amazingly approachable through Instagram. I'm always surprised by that.
Me too. I've had
yeah.
some really good moments with people both
Yeah.
saying that they like my work or me posting something and just having a conversation with someone and being like, wow, your
Yeah.
work is amazing. And they're just like, that's so
Yeah.
nice. I was at an opening last night and I was introduced to someone whose work I knew, but I didn't know personally. And
Uh-huh.
maybe it was like a little bit goofy, but the first thing I said to them was, oh, I love your work. And I truly meant it. And they were like, oh, like it was just such a nice
Yeah.
reaction. And I didn't ask anything of them, it's just like
Yeah.
I just really like your work.
No, I think that's kind of like, yeah, that's definitely sort of step one to making those relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. Being kind, being genuine, but also going after things that you want. If you really want a studio visit with someone, like don't bombard them, but ask for it. Or if you know someone who knows that person, being like, hey, I would love to have a studio visit with this person.
Yeah.
You can introduce me,
And that's also something that is funny. I was talking to another artist about that. Is it's a lot more common, I think, in a larger city to just ask other artists if you could stop by their studio. Whereas I don't see it happen as much in Raleigh, but it is common enough, and people aren't generally surprised when you do it.
Yeah, I think people generally like it. I feel very flattered
Mhm.
when someone says they either want me to come see their work and get
Mhm.
feedback, or they would just are interested enough in what I'm making that they want to come to my studio and see. I feel like either way, I will say reciprocate though. Like if someone comes to your studio, then offer to go to their studio. Yeah. Anyway, that kind of stuff goes a long way.
And yeah, Sherry, the recording will be sent out in a few days of this whole program, so you can totally catch up. Um, um, Lastly, my last question is, so do you have like, where do you get essentially like your motivation to make work? Or do you just magically are motivated to make work every day?
I'm not motivated to make work every day at all. I wish I was. It was funny. I was just at an opening last night, so a lot of this is fresh, but I was talking to a woman that I know that makes incredible paintings. And she's had a lot of gallery success. And I sort of assumed in talking to her that I was like, you must be just like in the studio nonstop. And she was like, no, like I have moments where I'm working and moments where I'm not. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting to hear, because someone like this who is making a living off of their paintings and
Mhm.
um really producing a lot of work also has these sort of like fits and spurts of production, and that is always how I've worked.
Mhm.
Whether I was in school or out of school, I tend to work in bursts, so I don't make work every day. I don't even make work every month. I would say sometimes it's every few months I make like a bunch of stuff, and then I kind of ruminate
Mhm.
on it. I collect, I guess a big part of my process also is just like collecting information. So the thing that I do continually do is take photos, write down notes of things I want to make, just kind of keep a catalog of things that are interesting to me. I don't
Mhm.
know where that inspiration necessarily comes from. I think that some of
Uh-huh.
it is sort of intrinsic to who I am. And hence my career, I just like to collect information and like make sense of it. So
Uh-huh.
that's always kind of been a process to me. And then I think most people that, artists can understand this, that like whether you're making a lot of work or not, you're kind of always an artist. And I have to remind myself of that sometimes too, when I'm a little hard on myself about how much time I am or am not spending making art,
Uh-huh.
and that, you
Yeah.
can stop making. I remember learning, I think it was Agnes Martin didn't make work for like 7 years or it was like 4 years or seven. It was a really big chunk of time.
Uh-huh.
I was sort of floored by that, because Agnes Martin is easily one of my favorite artists on the
Uh-huh.
planet. And to know that she just didn't make work for this huge chunk of time was very reassuring.
Yeah.
So that was a good reminder to me. It's something that I kind of think think to myself a lot when I'm not making work, and when I'm not finding the time for it. But I think in the back of my mind, it's always kind of there. It's like just part of what I do, and who I am. And I hope to always produce work in some capacity. Um,
Yeah,
but yeah,
I think all artists go through much the same thing.
yeah.
But yeah, you do have your whole life to make artwork as well.
It's a long
Yeah.
game. It's a long game. I remind
Yeah.
my personal motto is it's a marathon, not a sprint. Like
Yeah,
you
totally.
never know. You never know where things are gonna land. There's lots and lots of time to make work and to have success. And what success looks like to you might be different than what success looks like to me, but like we all kind of have our own version of what's good.
Mhm.
And for me, it's like I like if I'm included in like 1 or 2 shows a year, if my work gets published somewhere, if I go to a residency once every 5 years, like it's a
Yeah.
very wide margin for what I consider to be like
Yeah.
successful at this point. And maybe it looks a lot different than, when I was in grad school and I expected to be in 10 shows a year. So,
And speaking of which, do you spend a lot of time pursuing residencies?
not right now. I have in the past, and I found them to be really beneficial. I can never, because of work and now also with the kid, I can't really do long-term ones, but there's a lot of like 1 or 2 week residencies.
Mhm.
I have had a lot of success with them, but my pro tip is go in with a project plan. Do not go in blind because you will waste
Mhm.
all of your time. If you are lucky enough to go to a really long residency, it's different. But if you're going for like a 1, 2, 3 week residency,
Mhm.
go in with an idea of what you want to work on. You never know where things might go. In fact, that those black cutout papers were a result of I went to a residency and they had a screen printing shop. I was told there's a screen printing
Uh-huh.
shop, and it ended up being like a very lo-fi screen printing shop. And I knew that the likelihood that I would be able to print out transparencies was low. So I brought this really nice black paper to hand cut stencils that I would use to burn screens. And then I was going to
Mhm.
with them. Long
Yeah.
story short is that the screens had like really wide mesh. The exposure unit was really crappy. Like all of it was bad. And like the prints I
Uh-huh.
made were not coming out good. But I had a studio visit while I was there, one of the visiting artists, and she was like, these are really beautiful. And I was like, I've been starting to think that they're actually the hand cut stencils that were meant to be for screen printing were works unto themselves. And I
Uh-huh.
shifted my perspective like right then from trying to make screen prints, which is what I'd done throughout grad school and really loved doing, to
Uh-huh.
then letting the cutouts be their own work. So that happened because of a residency mistake. And
Yeah,
it
that's
ended up
awesome.
changing everything. It was like a huge shift in my work.
I have found in my own work that sometimes, yeah, things like that are like can be the best outcomes, like being forced sometimes to figure out an answer to something that there's not a great answer for, or producing on the fly sometimes.
Yeah. One of the things, the reason I started making these little watercolors was because I have a studio space at my husband's shop. He's a sign painter.
Mhm.
But I haven't had time to go. So I was thinking about what could I make in my house at my
Mhm.
desk without having to have like a massive studio set up. And I was already kind of doing those block prints and the ink drawings. I ended up with the ink because we did a secret Santa at work years ago, and it might have been when I first started working at Noguchi, and I ended up getting 2 bottles of India ink, the orange ink and the black ink, and that was how I ended up working with that. So you never know where your inspiration is going to come, or what materials are going to land in your lap, or what thing will not work and then force you to make something else, or what size paper can fit on your desk. You just start making work that way. I think I've always adapted my practice a bit to what I could like functionally do within my given environment.
Mhm.
And that I guess is something that I'm uh wasn't super intentional in doing, but I'm glad that I've had that flexibility in my practice. Like I've never
Mhm.
like my thesis was a 30-foot by 4-foot
Yeah.
screen print that had about 300 layers on it. I'm never gonna make something like that again. So, you know, make good with the resources that you have, whether they're incredible studios at a school or a 3-foot wide desk in your living room.
Yeah. Well, does anyone else have any questions? I think that kind of wraps up all the questions that I have.
Those are great questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Um, all right. Well, if no one else has any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and end this. Like I was saying earlier, the recording is going to be sent out in a couple of days, and please, guys, come back for our program next month. Oh, also, if anyone was interested in residencies, a great place to look is Penland here in North Carolina. They offer residencies all the time. So that might be a great place to start if that's something that you're interested in pursuing. All right, everyone. Well, thank you again. And thank you so much, Janine. It was awesome to have you out here.
Yeah.
When I end it, just stay on for a second and we'll wrap things up.
Okay.